wondering what y'all's comments and thoughts were with the Nick Fuentes interviews on Fresh and Fit and Jaimee on Tim Cass this past week since the last NPO show. God bless you too. I actually want to talk about that for a second. I want to talk about it.
Should we just kind of take a little swift and let's talk about it for a second?
Let's talk about that first. Let's get into
do it
that.
for Emery. Girl.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm so glad you asked.
I'm so glad you asked. We were just talking about it right before this started. I'm so glad you asked.
Right.
So while I was doing my makeup, I started watching the Tim Cass interview. We'll go through that first and then we'll get to Fresh and Fit. I saw the Tim Cass. I started yesterday when I was at the gym, and then I finished it today while I was getting ready. And girl, like, she was just triggered. Like,
there's no other word for it.
I think, Tim Pool is a very balanced and moderate person. He didn't vote for Trump in 2016. He was always a libertarian. He does come from the left. Actually, was always a leftist and a liberal. Used to work for Vice News, for those of you who don't know. And Tim Cass has been around for a very long time. And those people that call him a grifters are trash. I don't have to like him necessarily. I'm not a huge fan, but he's not a grifter. He built a platform for years, maybe like 15 years. Anyways, Tim Pool was basically questioning Jaimee, who's the founder of Gays Against Groomers, as to why don't you like Trump anymore? Let's talk about this, what it is that he's done wrong, and also DeSantis. And Jaimee goes on to basically give him an explanation of why she doesn't like Trump. But before any of that happened, she was just taking jabs and trashing Trump supporters. Oh, you can't piss off Magadonians, like they're so crazy, and Trump supporters this, and the cult base and the cult personality. And it was just one insult after another, after another, after another, and basically playing victim. She never clarifies why people have a problem with her. She never actually says how nasty she's been to many of us, ourselves included, when she was like trying to argue and trash us on Twitter
for literally
many
no
other
reason
things
at all
that she has done behind closed doors. She doesn't want to talk about that. She doesn't want to talk about how last year, immediately after DeSantis won re-election, when she totally abandoned Trump, she doesn't want to talk about the fact that she started trashing her own friends, including DC Drano, Rahib, I don't know how to say his last name, the guy from National Polls. She doesn't want to talk about any of that. She just wants to talk about how horrible and vile and bad MAGA Trump supporters are. To what Tim Pool has to say, it's like, my experience has been completely different. If I tell people, MAGA people or whatever, if I tell people, hey, I didn't like this, he gave the country to Fauci or whatever, most people are like, okay, let's talk about it. Like, they don't have a lot of horrible things to say. He's like, however, the DeSantis campaign, I can't say anything. It's the cult. They come at you, they're vile, they have a lot of hatred, they're nasty. So, and he gave an example what happened to him when he criticized them for, I think it was the CGI, the CGI Fauci stuff. And then there was something else when he learned that Jazz Jennings, the transgender, she got surgery here when she was underage. She got surgery here in Florida. So he posted a tweet that was actually pretty misleading. I'll say that, like, is this really happening in DeSantis' Florida? And as opposed to Christina Pusha coming back and answering like a press secretary would or a communications person would, with the audience that Tim Cass has, you could get away with somebody like us who has a smaller audience. You're talking about Tim Cass. She was very nasty, very catty, mean girl status, like she always is. What are you gonna do? Cry about it, cope about it, do this, blah. So it's a huge turnoff. And so Jaimee had to switch the topic because after a while of going back and forth and getting pushback, and they were really nice. She said, I don't want to talk about this anymore. Let's move on to another subject. DeSantis is still the worst person. She doesn't actually have
doesn't have any arguments, but the truth is that the majority of them don't really have any arguments. So all they do is that they default to attacks because they need you to believe that Trump never had any accomplishments. So basically all that they've focused on are those last 6 months of Donald Trump's presidency, as if the rest of what he offered Americans had never happened. You can provide them a list of every accomplishment that Trump had while he was in office, including the accomplishments that he's continued to have while being out of office. I want to make a statement of something that has occurred to me to this narrative that continues to pop up about how Trump handed the country over to Fauci. Trump did no such thing.
No.
Fauci was the director of infectious diseases for this country since 1985. We are talking about close to 40 years of experience in that role. That is a role specifically designed to deal with a situation like we had in 2020 with COVID-19.
Right.
Trump is not a scientist. He's not a doctor. What he's supposed to do as the leader at that moment is default to the expert. And at that point, not because Trump had assigned Fauci as the expert at that moment, but because Fauci had already been assigned the expert for that role for the last 40 years. And here's a curiosity that a lot of people don't talk about. Most people had no idea who Fauci was. Incredibly enough, you know who did know who Fauci was prior to 2020? The anti-vaxxers. Those people did know.
I posted Fauci before that.
Correct, because you were a true, and you were exposing the truth about shots way before 2020. Those people did know. The average person did not know. And you want me to tell you what's something that you better thank Trump for? That if it wasn't for Trump putting Fauci in the public eye in 2020, he wouldn't have retired after 40 years in 2022.
Yeah. And, you know, her whole thing is like, oh, nothing. She's very sarcastic. Oh, nothing's ever Trump's fault. Like, because here's the thing. When you debate ideas or policy or whatever it is, you can't, like, there's always going to be a pushback, right? Even if it comes from the cult or not from the cult. So if I say, Trump didn't hand over the country to Fauci, you can't just say because, and I give my explanation, you can't just say, oh, it's nothing's ever Trump's fault. Well, it's a debate. I'm going to debate your point. And you can come back and say, well, I still think he did hand over the country to Fauci. I thought it was petty. I thought it was dumb. There was a point where Tim Cass was actually right about this. And I've had this conversation before with people when she was talking about the vaccine and how horrible it is because Trump has pushed a vaccine and it's had adverse reactions. And he claims that it saved 100 million lives. You know, he doesn't take any accountability for any of the potential reactions. Tim Cass says, well, and she says, well, you know, he like rushed it in 9 months. And he goes, yeah, but when did you pay attention to how this specific medicine was made?
How the industry operated?
When did you start paying attention how the industry works? Like, did you care about that for the polio vaccine, for the MMR, for the DTaP? When did you talk about that at all? She's like, well, and it was like a struggle for her to come to the conclusion that's like, you're being very unbiased because Trump never wanted to force this onto anybody. So that's for me. I thought it was embarrassing. I went on Twitter and I mean, everybody was memeing her. Everybody was like, why is she so triggered? Like, this is so wrong. And also you got to understand that there's 75 million Trump supporters. There's actually probably more. Let's say that he's lost some support. I don't care. Let's say he's 65 million for shits and giggles. And let's say out of those 65 million, 10% are online and they know who she is. Now you're alienating so much of the Republican base and people that have promoted your platform, the people that have promoted your organization, Gays Against Groomers, people that have donated their money into your organization. When you call us a cult, we are going to react like a cult, which means we're not going to support your shit. We're not going to share your content. We're not going to donate. And we're going to make sure that other people don't, because there's no incentive to help your cause when you think that we're all cultists because we don't jump off the Trump bandwagon when you found it convenient, because it's actually about convenience. It's very much about money.
Well, it's about the grift. It always was about the grift, because why did people know who she was? It's because she was such a loud person for MAGA.
Yeah,
that was her whole grift, was MAGA.
It was very hard to hear, and we don't want to make the whole show out this because there's so many more interesting.
I will say one last thing before we move on. Like, if you think she's a horrible person, you have
no idea.
You guys genuinely have no idea. There really is certain things that, for the sake of just peace, life, focusing on the things that we need to focus on and not adding on more bullshit, that we make the decision not to talk about. But trust when we tell you that if you think she's a horrible person, you have no idea exactly what a horrible, despicable person she is.
She'll like screw over her friends for whatever. Yeah. And as far as the Fresh and Fit podcast, the first thing that I'm going to say is that we called it.
That's
and
the first thing we're going to say.
I don't know if we said it live, but we've said it to ourselves multiple times because now they're being targeted by Media Matters. What happens is that Media Matters, which is funded by George Soros, they're basically exposing right-wing extremism. And whenever a new organization or a movement starts,
any kind of opposition
or any
type
narrative of opposition, they literally assign journalists to follow that group or that content of the organization. They're doing it to Moms for Liberty.
They have at least 7 assigned to the Manosphere
right? So their entire funnel to get you the platform, which is what I think it's going to happen with Fresh and Fit on YouTube, is to create a narrative that they're so extreme, they're so misogynistic. They're also now bringing on Nick Fuentes, who's a Holocaust denier and a white nationalist. So now they're have an avenue to request for Twitter to ban them. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see Fresh and Fit completely offline on YouTube,
which is terrible. Not something that we would ever want. We want them to continue to advocate for that at all.
We're not going to be on the side of the censorship.
Let me just say that ourselves. Absolutely.
Let me just say that we are not advocating ever for the censorship of Fresh and Fit or anybody else. It doesn't matter who it is. We're just explaining to you how it works because we've seen it happen. They've tried to do it in Moms for Liberty as well. They just released they actually sent people to this event. They sent a reporter to the Moms for Liberty summit that just happened last weekend. So she could report on everything, including their food. She literally made posts about how much food and how elegant it was and how much money they must have because they were serving cocktails or this. They made a post about milk. They literally were, they're so insane that they took a picture of the coffee table and they said, oh, they have liberal milk, oat milk, almond milk, soy milk. And I'm like, this is literally what our journalists are paid to do.
Having experienced firsthand that funnel that Linda just explained of how it is that they use publications like Media Matters to label your content and then use that to pressure these platforms to deplatform you and become a problem. It's unfortunate, but we feel like out of naiveness and not knowing any better, because these people have never really been involved in the political sphere and they're just now kind of like dabbing into it because of the association with Fuentes. It's unfortunate, but I feel like they're being very naive and very careless because they feel like they're on top of the world right now.
Right.
And the truth of the matter is that these publications,
no one is more powerful than these people.
You might think Media Matters is no big deal. It's just a little publication, but it's not. Media Matters in itself is the machine behind it. That's just a place to be able to document your quote unquote behavior, your misbehavior,
your content,
so that then they can use that to pressure companies. And make no mistake, this is going to bring a lot of attention, not just to Fresh and Fit, but to all of the other red pill content that's out there.
Pearl is going to get some stuff.
Sure. I wouldn't be surprised, and I hope that that's not the case. I don't want to see it, but I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing more articles that read YouTube continues to allow
the way that they ended that article about Fuentes being on Fresh and Fit was actually like, they didn't just stop at YouTube. They said the FCC, which regulates everything, the media, broadband, and broadband companies continue to allow this type of content because there's no moderation. Could you imagine if we get the FCC to start moderating what goes on, even more now that comes from the federal government, as opposed to these companies, as private companies having regulations in terms of services? It's going to be really bad. I watched some of the I didn't watch the Fresh and Fit podcast between Fuentes and the girls, or the one that he had just with them. The one that I saw was a debate between Destiny and Sneeko and some crazy guy Zerka and Nick and the guys from Fresh and Fit that were only moderating. I thought that Destiny was fumbling a little bit when he wouldn't admit that the ADL does have a target on Nick's back. Everyone knows that. We know that. The whole world knows that. He's not
Yeah.
allowed to be on Twitter. The reason why he's not allowed to be on Twitter is because he's a Holocaust denier. And as a result, the ADL has a target on their back, and they pressured Twitter to not let him on because it would upset the advertisers.
So I think that's the part, that part right there that you just said, I think it's actually the part that Destiny got wrong, because in his logic, he's like, oh, the ADL has a $500 million budget, but Meta makes trillions of dollars and Twitter makes billions of dollars. So you really think that this little budget is what makes the difference? No, that's actually not how it works at all. That budget is actually used to, I don't want to say buy off, but to influence politicians. Doesn't take a lot. I mean, we have George Soros openly talking about how all it takes is $10,000 to buy a state rep or a senator. It takes very little little financial influence to steer a politician a certain way. And the pressure that comes towards Twitter and Meta doesn't come directly from the ADL, despite the fact that they do also get pressure from the ADL. The real pressure gets applied when the ADL uses their funds to push legislation that can be used against Twitter and Facebook. That's where the problematic comes in. So, Destiny made it a point like, oh, they don't really have the budget for that. I think that you're just kind of paranoid. It's like, well, they're not paranoid.
They're not paranoid.
It's not just the ADL. It's also the ACLU and many other organizations
and the federal government as well, and the feds
that spend a significant amount of money lobbying our government to pass laws or acts or whatever it may be that are protective of this one group of people. So, for him to say that that's not the case, I do agree that there's definitely a heightened sense of paranoia that maybe exists on the internet when talking about these things that's maybe unjustified, but there is an aspect of it that very much is. And the censorship really does exist, and it's a censorship that's really only one-sided for one group of people. And it's not that there's anything wrong with recognizing that. I think that we should just accept that it's like, well, if certain laws exist to protect certain groups, and they should exist to protect all groups.
And you know what? The last thing I'll say, because we're already 23 minutes into the stream, is that it sucks. Like, it sucks that you're not allowed to question one event in history. And that might sound horrible to some people, and you may think, well, that's wrong, that's right. Freedom of speech, as written by the Constitution, doesn't have a limit on what you can and cannot say, right? We know that if it's threats or violence, then it becomes different. That you're entering into dangerous territory for free speech. The problem here is that you can't question or talk about one group of people, a very small minority. And that I feel like it's not just problematic in terms of speech, but it also makes people research more, because it sparks curiosity. That saying, curiosity killed a cat. And so I think that they're actually creating more of a, what do I call this?
Well, it feeds the conspiracy.
It feeds the conspiracy.
It feeds the conspiracy that there's a censorship of that there's a particular censorship when you do censor people that talk about it. So
yeah.
But let's move on to some of the